Welcome all PCU members. I have received several questions about Rook versus a minor piece. Is it a draw? Is it a win? Well, in this lesson, I'll try to show you some examples and answer the question. Well, let's get started with the very first example, where white has a rook and king versus black's king and bishop. I would like to stress that all the advice and comment I'm going to give about the rook versus bishop endgames only relates to positions when there are no other pawns or pieces on the board. So it's a four-piece position, king rook versus king bishop, or in some later example in the lesson we'll see king and knight versus king and rook. Well, the general assessment is, in most positions, assuming that the weaker side, that is the side with the bishop, plays well, the result will be a draw. However, there are numerous exceptions, and I'm going to show you some of them. The position we see right now in front of us is one of the normal regular positions where if black continues playing correctly without any major mistakes, the game should end in a draw. The rule of thumb is that white will try to push the black king towards the edge of the board where it will be more limited and possibly could be checkmated. On the other hand, black should try to avoid as much as possible in getting to the A file, H file, first rank or eighth rank with his king. For example, if in this position white would try to give a check to the black king, while it may be dangerous if the king doesn't move to the right square by losing the bishop on f4, but if the king finds the only correct option, moving to e3, which protects now the bishop, then black should have nothing to fear. For example, king f5, the bishop just could move away to c7 or d6, and playing just normally, understanding the concept that you'd want to stay with your king in the middle of the board as much as possible, you should be fine in holding on to the game and making a draw. Of course, with white, I suggest you try to win and look for opportunities. Maybe you will be able to win the black bishop somehow or checkmate the black king. As I said, typically you would have to try to force the black king to the edge of the board or try to win the bishop by a tactical tool, either a fork, a pin, or sometimes a discovery. Okay, let's move on to the next position where it will be one of those special situations that white is able to win the bishop right away. So in this situation, what we see is that the black king and bishop are on the same rank, and therefore white is ready and able to give an immediate fork by moving the rook to f4, and as we can see now, the rook is attacking in both directions, the king and the bishop. The king is forced to move out of the attack, and then the white rook is free to capture the black bishop with no compensation whatsoever for black. So this is one situation. Let's see another one. Here we go. In the next example, again, black is suffering because the king and the bishop are on the same file. And while here, it's not the white rook moving, but the king moving out of the rook's way will create the skewer. The king moves anywhere actually, any of the four moves of the king other than moving to d2 does the job, moves out of the rook's way, checks the black king, and now after the king moves wherever, the white rook will be capturing the black bishop for free. So again, white accomplishes the goal, wins the bishop, and then of course king and rook versus a sole king will be a pretty simple win. Let's move on, and here we go. Again, same problem. For black, the king and bishop are on the same rank, and white is ready to pin. This time moving the rook to a3, attacking the bishop, and the black king is too far away to protect his only teammate. And therefore, the next move, the rook will capture the bishop for free, and white will win rather easily after that. Okay, let's move on. Here we go. Again, we have a situation where white is able to win the game. Although here the black king and bishop are not on the same file or rank. However, the two kings and the white rook are on the same file, and that allows white an unexpected discovered check that will allow white to win black's bishop. After king d4, black is in check, and regardless where the king goes, the black bishop will not be protected, and the white king will just capture it on the very next move. Let's move on. And now we're moving to different situations where there is neither an immediate way to win the bishop, nor are both the king and the bishop somewhere in the middle of the board. Here, white already achieved something, namely that the black king has been stuck to the back rank, that is to the edge of the board. As you can see, the physical limitations of the chessboard upward, there is no rank above the 8th rank, and on the right side of the board, there is no file beyond h. Therefore, the king is greatly limited in mobility. However, this position is still a draw. So remember, if your king is in the corner and your bishop is of opposite color than the rook that the opponent has, then it's still a draw. As we shall see in a future example, on the other hand, if the king is where it is right now, but the black bishop would be running on the dark squares, in that case, white would win rather easily. Okay, so white can try right now to give a check on b8. And then the only move for black is to block the check with the bishop. But that actually does the job. It blocks the check and also saves the game at the same time. White's problem is that white cannot make progress. If the rook remains pinning the bishop on the 8th rank, that would result in an immediate stalemate. So that's certainly no success. On the other hand, if, let's say, white moves the king, giving a little bit of fresh air for the black king to move out, then again, black's bishop is safe, and when the white rook, let's say, would come back to b2, which would indeed threaten with checkmate with rook h2, black would have sufficient time to move the bishop again, somewhere like c4 or d5, and then after a check from the other side, from h2, rook moving to h2, the king could be simply moving to g8. And after, for example, rook attacking the bishop, rook c2, the bishop can just move away, for example, check, king h7, and white cannot make progress. So, what is the moral of the story? It is that even if the king is cornered and the bishop is able to move to the square next to the corner, the position generally is a draw. Okay, however, let's see some situations when black has the right colored bishop, the king is supposedly in the right corner, and still the game is lost. Let's look at that example. And here we go. Okay, what is the difference between this position and the previous one that we just saw? Well, the big difference is that the bishop has serious difficulty in getting onto that diagonal that would reach the g8 or h7 squares, the light squares near the corner square h8. However, white has to be very tricky and find the correct way, making sure the black bishop doesn't get into the right position. What white is trying to do is to use one of the tactics that we talked about in the first few positions, where white will be able to fork the black bishop or perhaps pin it or make a discovery. Quite amazingly, the centralizing move rook to d4 is the one to lead to a win. And amazingly, black is in a Zugzwang. What does Zugzwang mean? Well, Zugzwang is a German word for a situation that describes that one side wishes not needing to move. It means that whatever move you have to make, because as we know in chess, it's not only your right to make a move, but it's an obligation. When it's your turn, you cannot pass like in some other board games or card games. So therefore you have to move, and with that move, you are ruining your position. And it is a very common theme, especially in endgames in chess. Well, right now, let's examine the various moves that black has at his disposal. Let's start with bishop moves first. If the bishop moves to g4, it obviously will be simply captured. If the bishop moves to f5 or to e6, the white king will capture it simply. If the bishop moves instead to d7, the rook will capture it. Okay, so now let's look at some decent squares where it won't be captured immediately. How about bishop to c8? Well, what do we see? What did we learn from the first few positions? We learned that when the king and the bishop are along the same rank or file, that can be a potential cause of danger, of trouble. And that's the case here because the white rook is ready to move down to d8 and fork the king and the bishop. A similar scenario would happen if the bishop would move right now to g2. Then the check would come from g4, and again the black king and bishop would be forked. Let's go back again. And let's see the remaining bishop move, which is moving the bishop to f1. Well, right now there is no immediate fork or pin or skewer or discovery. So how can white still win the game? Well, here white has to play real fine and combine the ideas of winning the bishop with threats to checkmate the black king. Here the winning move is moving the king to g6 with a simple threat of checkmate on the 8th rank. So on pretty much any bishop move, that's what would happen, other than of course black giving a check right now on d3, which the rook would just capture. But how about if the king runs out to f8 with the idea that if now rook d8, then king gets out on e7? Well, the catch is that the rook will give the check from the other side, and sadly for black, again the bishop is lost. Quite amazing, isn't it? Let's go back again to the beginning. Do you still remember what was the winning move here for white? Amazingly, the quiet and peaceful looking centralizing move rook d4 put black into a situation where he must put the bishop in a losing situation. On the other hand, if the king would move instead of the bishop, if the king moves to the left, then checkmate arrives right away. On the other hand, if the king moves to the h file, then again, voila, fork. Well, this was a very instructive example on how you can possibly win a bishop in a practical example. Let's move on. And here we go. Here is the position where we have a very similar scenario, that is a corner king, but the wrong colored bishop. Remember, if the bishop would be on g8 on a light square, the game is a draw. Assuming it's black to move, of course. And white doesn't checkmate immediately in the corner. So that is, the bishop is ready to block the check on g8. So the bishop could be, for example, on e6 or d5 or c4 or b3, and the game would be a draw. Not g8 at the very moment when it's white's turn, and white would be ready to checkmate or force the win of the bishop with rook h1. So, let's look at a situation when we have a dark squared bishop. Here the big problem is that when it's white's turn or black's turn, white will win. Right now, white can easily win by playing rook a8, pinning the bishop. Although the king can move right next to the bishop, protecting it, the problem is again the same zugzwang theme that we talked about earlier, which is the situation when, after a evading move, black gets in a situation that he is forced to move. If black would say, I pass, the game would be a draw. But black is not allowed to say that. At every move, after your opponent's move, you have to make your move. You cannot just say, I'm not moving. And when the king makes its only move, that will result in rook capturing the bishop, checkmate. Let's go back one more time. I just would like to point out that if white would make another random move, such as rook a2, white would still be winning the game because there's nothing black could do against white moving the rook up to a8 on the next move. So white would be still winning the same way. For example, king g8, rook a8, and again black will have to move back to the corner and get checkmated. On the other hand, it would be a major mistake moving the king, let's say, to f5, because that would allow the black king to get out of the corner and out of trouble. And now let's change the topic a tiny bit and let's talk about situations when we'll have rook versus knight, not a bishop but a knight. As we know, either the bishop or the knight are worth 3 points, while the rook is worth 5. So typically, it's a significant advantage. And in the middle game, when there are numerous other pieces on the board, it most of the time guarantees a win. However, when we're down to these core pieces, just the rook versus the minor piece, generally it is a draw, assuming that black defends correctly. Defending the random rook and bishop position versus a rook and knight, the rook and bishop is a much easier draw than a rook and knight. There are much more dangers in losing when you have the knight than when you have the bishop. Let's see now the next example. Here we go. This is one of the random examples when the king is not cornered and there is no immediate way to win the black knight. Therefore, this position is a draw. For example, after a check with the rook on a3, black really could go anywhere not to lose the game. However, the same principle applies here as well as what we talked about with the bishop, that the king should attempt to try to stay in the middle of the board as much as possible and away from the sides of the chessboard. So king f4 would mostly comply with that plan. And let's see now another situation where knight gets into immediate trouble. Here we go. And just as when we talked about with king and bishops versus the rook, here again the problem is when the king and the knight are on the same rank or file with each other. And in this case, white is able to pin black's knight and king immediately by playing rook f3, and it's goodbye knight, and then eventually goodbye to the game. King and rook is a simple win against a lone king. And finally, let's see two positions where, in a tricky way, white is able to win against the knight. Here we go. In this position, the black king is in the corner and the knight is near it, although not quite near it. In most situations, unless the knight is the one cornered, the game should be savable for black, including in this position. However, it requires very delicate defense. For example, if white starts with rook g7, black has only one reasonable move where the knight will not be captured right away. However, that is sufficient to save the game. Knight e6, rook e7. Now, the rook is threatening to capture the knight as well as to checkmate with rook e8. However, the knight is able to move back to f8, and after rook e8, pinning the knight, the king and the knight are close enough to each other for the king to come to protect the knight, and black is just fine. Of course, next, as soon as black will have the opportunity, should try to get out of the corner to avoid being in a delicate situation. Let's go back and see a better attempt for white. Let's say white makes a waiting move such as rook to g3. Now black has to be real careful where to go. In fact, there is only one correct knight move, although seemingly 3 of them are playable. Let's see first the wrong answers. Knight h7 would be a mistake, because it would give the opportunity for white to play king g6 right now, and after knight f8, king f7, and now if the knight goes to the queen side to d7, then white could just checkmate with rook h3, or if the knight goes back to h7, rook g8 checkmates and ends the game. If after rook g3, black instead plays knight e6, then again the problem is the white king coming over to the f file and will threaten with a checkmate along the h file. And if black would try to get out of the corner with king g8, the problem is the discovery, king f6, attacking the black knight while checking the black king simultaneously. Therefore, the knight will be history. The only correct defense for black after rook g3 is to play knight d7. Now, after king g6, king g8. There is no discovered check like in the previous variation that would win the knight. And after rook d3, the knight could just fork right away and win the rook. Although, as we know, king and knight versus a king is not sufficient to win anyway, so the game will still end in a draw. And let's see our final example. Here we go. Now, this is a whole different ballgame. The black king is not cornered. However, the black king and knight are widely separated. And unlike with the situation with the bishop, where that's not a problem at all, because the bishop is a long-range piece and has many squares to go to and can anytime in one move get close to the king, even if it's physically, visually far away from each other. The knight typically would need a whole bunch of moves to get close back to the king. The problem here is that if white plays correctly, the knight will never get back near the king. The black knight can be trapped. What white needs to do is take away the squares where the knight can jump to. And the correct first move is rook d3, which takes away the c3 and g3 escape squares. Now the knight is limited to squares on the first rank. And sadly for black, the king is too far to help to protect the knight. King b6, and now rook e3, attacking the knight. The knight, let's say, tries to go on the side where the king is, so maybe the king can help to protect, but the black king is just a bit too far. King d4, king b5, king c3. Now white is simply threatening to play king b2, and then the knight would be trapped. But how about if the knight tries to escape? Check. Well, bit too slow. King b3, And after knight b4, and it seems like the king is just on time protecting the knight, but not quite, because after rook e5 check, the black king will be forced to move away from the knight, and then king takes knight again reaches a winning position. Well, I hope all of this gives you more information, more knowledge on how to deal with positions with rook versus a minor piece such as a bishop or knight. Thank you for listening, and be back for some more interesting information and knowledge in chess next week. Thank you. Bye-bye.